London, in the early 1990s. The Addams family is the most feared criminal organisation in Britain.
No one would step out of line against the Addams. They were all powerful.
Their reputation grew across the years from being involved in extreme acts of violence and almost conducting a reign of terror.
Terry Addams and his two brothers, Patsy and Tommy, are building a £200 million empire as a new wave of addicts demand more and more highs.
What do you do with those wads of cash? You can't drink it all, so they were sticking it up their nose with cocaine.
It's drugs now. It's all drugs. I mean, we're talking hundreds of millions of pounds.
It's a violent trade, choreographed by an invisible puppet master.
Terry is a businessman. He abhors limelight, publicity. He just doesn't want it.
The police are fighting a losing battle.
The Addams family have proved pretty much untouchable.
There's no witnesses that are going to identify anybody. There was no forensic evidence. And unless somebody speaks about it, somebody tells us that what they've said, there's just no way of solving that.
The Addams brothers are untouchable, protected by fear.
After Terry Addams asked him to hurt someone double bad, one of his phrases was, "I'll open him up like a bag of crisps."
They liked to drink, they liked to laugh. There was always an undercurrent of menace, which just would not disappear.
London, the 1960s. The greatest port in the world is falling into ruin. Petty criminals rule the inner city. Violent crime is a survival strategy for the Addams family with its 11 children.
Their methods of operating were very much old school. Things that you saw in the Sweeney, things that you saw in Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels, real use of muscle to get your own way.
You didn't cross them. You didn't, you know, if they wanted something, they got it, and you didn't go against them.
Barry Faulkner is brought up alongside the gangsters who rule London.
In those days, there was a huge gulf between the haves and the have-nots. There really was. And you could see them all in their lovely cars and all the rest of it, and you thought, well, why can't we have a bit of that? Dad would start off and he'd come home with a couple of shins of beef and a new telly or whatever, and all great, like that.
The ambitious Addams brothers make a name for themselves, extorting money from market traders.
You go down a row of market stalls, a couple of heavies, and knock all these stalls over, stuff broken. Oh, you don't want that to happen again. If you give us X amount a week, it's not going to happen. Okay. It was protection.
In Islington in those days, the one name that constantly cropped up was the name Addams.
Peter Kirkham is one of the beat officers patrolling the estates of Islington.
They were a family of Irish origin. They had 11 children. Their father was called George. He worked at various stages as a lorry driver, as a porter at Smithfield Market. There were all these other brothers and sisters in the family, but it was just these three, Terry, Tommy and Patsy, who seemed to make it their business to form this little crime syndicate.
The London underworld in the 1960s is dominated by the legendary Krays. They court celebrity and callous violence.
The Kray brothers were not adverse to actually picking up a gun and going and shooting somebody in front of a lot of different witnesses, or stabbing somebody in front of a lot of witnesses, which in the end was their undoing. They worked on the basis that nobody would testify against them. In the end, people did testify against them.
It's quite possible that Terry Adams looked at the Krays, and the Krays courted publicity and soap stars and all that. And I think Terry Adams looked at them and thought, you bloody fools, that's not how you do it. Terry is a businessman. He abhors limelight, publicity. He just doesn't want it. He wants to stay in the background, getting on with his business.
Terry is now the shadowy leader of what has become known as the A-Team.
Terry became the organiser, styled himself as chief executive, I guess, would be how he saw himself.
Terry has always been the brains of the family. He's always the most savvy one, the smartest one, and certainly the one who did best in terms of what they did with the money they made. He was the one who kind of ran everything and oversaw everything and made the most sensible decisions.
Terry is the boss. His brother Tommy is the entrepreneur.
Tommy is a fixer.
Tommy got involved with financiers or the launderers of stolen money and goods. He'd also formed links with Jamaican yardie gangs, and so Tommy had sort of got involved in those sides of the business, and so he'd got access to large amounts of money one way or the other.
Then there is Patrick, or Patsy as he's known across North London.
Patrick was always the more physical one, the one who was more imposing, and he, in the early days certainly, was the muscle of the gang. He'd be the one to go out there and do the physical confrontations.
A bit of a live wire. He used to let his fists do the talking a bit too often and had to be reined in a bit, now and again by the other brothers.
Patsy was generally considered the most violent of the three. Though there's not a lot to choose between them, to be honest. Patsy was probably just more hands-on.
It's time for the next step up the criminal ladder.
The natural progression in those days was to armed robbery.
The golden age of armed robbery in London was in the 1970s. There was a lot of cash on the move. Lots of people were paid in cash. There were payrolls to be robbed way before electronic banking, so there was a need to be moving cash all the time.
So you went out, you did a post office, you and your mates, and you came out with enough money to keep the families going for a year. You got caught, you did 3 years, you're out in a year and a half.
Patsy is targeting a North London betting shop.
Where's the money? Come on, where's the money?
Give me the fucking key.
Come on!
Don't you fucking dare move.
Hours later, armed police track Patsy down to the heart of the Adams patch. With a gun stuck in his face, he's arrested. He gets 7 years.
I think that was a big turning point in the way the family grew. They'd started off dabbling in everything, but once Patrick got caught, they realised that armed robbery wasn't really the way to go. It was going to end up with big prison sentences, it was too dangerous. There were lots of incidents going on where the police were shooting armed robbers on the scene of their crimes.
Do not say anything!
London's crime world is starting to change. The police are fighting fire with firepower of their own.
To match this growing threat from the streets, submachine guns are now standard issue.
Armed robbery has become a risky business.
They thought, whoa, hang on a minute. This is all getting a bit dangerous now. We might get shot, we certainly might get locked up. And so With drugs becoming far more prevalent in society, they looked at that as a way of going into something that was less dangerous.
The really smart robbers were realising there wasn't much future in armed robbery, and that people were starting to invest their proceeds from robbery into things like drugs, because there was a much lower percentage chance of being caught, and potentially there was a lot more profit to be made out of drug dealing than there was out of armed robbery.
It was easy money. It was easy money. You didn't have to plan anything. You didn't have to break in anything. It was just, all you got to do was get them into the country. And you didn't do that. There was some other fool being a mule. He's the one that's going to get caught at customs and put down for 7 years, not you.
It's the 1980s. The narcotics trade is exploding. Drugs are a hugely lucrative business, and demand is growing fast. The London gangs go into battle for their share of the spoils. The Adams brothers will stake their claim to be London's dominant crime family. The 1980s. London is alive with city slickers with bundles of money to spend.
The city just exploded with people with loads of money. Suddenly they had mega money. What do you do with those wads of cash? You can't drink it all, so they were sticking it up their nose with cocaine.
A bulldozer was used to force entry. Inside, officers discovered the van they'd followed and part of the consignment of drugs. In all, a ton of high-quality South American cocaine was seized with a street value of £160 million.
Crime families like the Adams are making millions from the flood of lucrative drugs. A wave of violence breaks out as London's gangs carve up the new territory.
I first joined the police as a young, raw 18-year-old. In 1985, my ambition to become a Scotland Yard detective was met, and I was posted to the Central Drug Squad.
Peter Blexley becomes part of the Met's elite drug trafficking unit.
We were tasked with combating those involved in the importation, wholesaling and the distribution of major quantities of drugs. Already at that stage, the Adams family name was synonymous with that kind of crime.
He's fighting drug lords who make themselves almost invisible.
It's incredibly difficult to convict the kingpins who sit on top of the triangle because they rarely get their hands dirty. They don't touch the drugs. They don't transport the drugs. They don't package the drugs. They've got lackeys to do all that for them.
Seizures of cocaine were up by an alarming 125%. Most of it comes from South America.
It's the cocaine, I think, that we are worried about, the possible growth of that and the influence of South American drug barons.
The Adams brothers are surfing a wave of ever-increasing demand.
In the early days, the Adams were very much involved in the cannabis trade. It wasn't huge money, but you could easily double or treble your investment each time. With something like cocaine, you can spend far less because the raw material is much cheaper where you buy it at the supplier country. You might only spend £1,000 on a kilo of cocaine, but once you get it to the UK, you can sell it for £40,000.
Like all expanding crime enterprises, the Adams need cash. And the London underworld is awash with it.
Robbers got away with nearly 3 tons of gold bullion worth £26 million from the Brinksmat vault.
In 1983, a small-time gang breaks into the Brinksmat security warehouse at Heathrow.
The thieves moved 6,800 bars of pure gold, each one weighing 1 or 2 kilos, about 3 tons in all.
They were expecting £3 or £4 million worth of cash, but as it happened, they got about £26 million worth of gold bullion, cash and diamonds. And that gave them a problem.
They ended up having to call in extra vans to actually take away all the gold bars that they had because they just were so many.
And pretty much the whole of the top end of London criminality got involved one way or another in moving that around, in smelting it down, in moving it into other property, in laundering the proceeds, and the Adamses were linked to that.
Tommy Adams is observed handling gold bullion under police surveillance. But he claims he didn't realise it was from the Brinksmat robbery, and he's acquitted.
I think that still rankles with a lot of the officers involved in that Brinksmat investigation. That should have been the first time that one of the Adamses was convicted of something really substantial.
Millions of the now legendary profits from the Brinksmat gold are never recovered. And by a strange coincidence, the Adams brothers find themselves flush with money.
They'd be going to the most expensive boutiques, wearing the best suits. Terry in particular seemed to have a bit of a penchant for fairly flamboyant, very smart dressing. Someone once described him as the cross between Liberace and Peter Stringfellow.
He had a yacht, he had luxury cars, he had a house that he spent millions of pounds on. I think his garden alone cost some £70,000 to remodel, and the house was worth more than £1 million.
And that quite often is the sign that, hang on a minute, they've come into a few bob here, where might that have come from?
Once, when the main threat came from armed robbers, the police knew what they were dealing with. Now, since the boom in the drugs trade, there's no single group of active criminals.
They use them as a status symbol. The more they're used, the more important the gun becomes and the more important the user becomes.
Well, it's all... everything's been taken off it.
The Adams drugs business is now flourishing. Weapons multiply, and the battle for territory with rival mobs flares up.
There were shootings regularly around the Caledonian Road, and most of those were said to be linked directly or indirectly to the Adamses.
A police informant is returning home from a drink at his local pub.
He got out the car, up drove the motorbike, bang, 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 he was dead.
It's a new kind of assassination.
The word was that it was connected with the Adamses, but of course there was no evidence. There's no witnesses that are going to identify anybody. There was no forensic evidence apart from the bullets, which took us nowhere. And unless somebody speaks about it and somebody tells us that what they've said, there's just no way of solving that.
Gilbert Winter is one of a new breed of gangster. He's the Adams' #1 enforcer.
Gilbert Winter was a man mountain. He was a really fearsome figure, a classic Jamaican yardie who was in the UK and very quickly developed a reputation for being someone who would hurt people for money. As far as the Adams were concerned, Gilbert Winter was their go-to man whenever someone needed to be taken out. There are recordings of members of the Adams family talking to Gilbert Winter, and one of his phrases was, "I'll open him up like a bag of crisps."
Claude Mosley's life was ended on the steps of this semi-detached house in Bethune Road. His killing looks like yet another drugs murder.
Gilbert Winter was suspected of killing Claude Mosley on behalf of the Adams family, but of course that was never proven. He stood trial but was acquitted because the major prosecution witness refused to give evidence. He was intimidated, he was frightened. He received a paltry 3-month sentence for contempt of court, did that witness.
The killer shot them dead from the back seat of their car, parked in a lover's lane in Epping Forest. It's thought the killer, called cold-blooded by police, was possibly known to the victims.
Extreme violence is becoming commonplace. The Adams reputation is growing.
Terry was very much treated like a member of the royal family. Whenever he went into a room, everyone would stand up. That was the level of respect that he was given within the criminal community.
Nothing sticks to Terry Adams. And he finds himself the perfect partner.
Solly Nahome called himself an accountant. Now, I'm not entirely sure he was ever fully qualified, but in any event, it's safe to say he was a bookkeeper for the Adams family. I'm convinced that he helped launder millions of pounds through the books so they could spend it because it looked like legitimate money.
He was very quick, very sharp, very good with numbers, and he was very trusted by the Adams family because of the work he'd done for them early on. So he was brought in and very quickly became the linchpin of their organisation.
They started spending the money on legitimate businesses, and it was something Terry especially had tried to do to give a sort of veneer of respectability to what they were doing and to money that they had and to the lifestyle that they were living.
They were looking at greengrocery business, florist businesses, anything where you could disguise the amount of money coming in because it was being paid in cash.
The seemingly invulnerable Adams now decide it's time to send out a message to the London underworld.
The Adamses wanted total domination of North London and beyond. So what they did was they set a bit of a trap.
Patsy Adams approaches a pub used by the rival Riley family, challenges on their turf.
Patrick Adams was always the most physically imposing member of the gang. Went to a pub where the Rileys were known to drink.
He provocatively ordered a pint, sat at the bar and drank it. That was a red rag to a bull.
Immediately, phone calls started going out to the Riley gang members saying that this man had come into their territory. So they all got in a car and made their way there. No one actually got hit, no one got hurt, but the message was received loud and clear, and the Rileys didn't mess with the Adams after that.
That was really the sort of turning point. We were no longer talking about the Adamses as a local crime family. We were talking about the Adamses as this organised crime group that had tentacles everywhere.
The Adams brothers are the dominant force in the London underworld. Rivals have been put firmly in their place. But the police are fighting back. They have weapons that even the Adams fear.
Law enforcement knew they were a real problem, and something had to be done.
The Adamses have sent a message of defiance across the London underworld. Nobody messes with them. They've seen off their rivals, but this mob violence will have unforeseen consequences.
From the police's point of view, we were now extremely concerned that we were having this Wild West shootout sort of situation going on, and it was really the impetus for enough is enough. We've got to get a grip of this.
A rising opposition frontbencher is living only yards from the scene of the shootout in Islington.
There is a link between the problems that the inner cities have in housing and employment and a lack of hope for young people and the guns, knives and drugs culture, and that's why both have got to be tackled.
You're right. I know that Tony Blair at that time spoke to the Home Secretary and said, what are we going to do about these people? It's getting slightly embarrassing. You've got a major crime family living just round the corner and yet nothing's being done.
In the late 80s, early 90s, we didn't have DNA. There wasn't CCTV everywhere. All the things that are now, the number one thing that investigators go and look at, they just weren't there.
And the police are battling an enemy within.
It was well known in detective circles that the Adams family had corrupt detectives on their payroll. And let me tell you something, there is nothing more demoralising than working on a case for days, weeks, months, or even years, only for on the day in question, nothing happens. And then later on you find out a corrupt cop has compromised the investigation, has blown it out for a few grubby, filthy, rotten £1,000 in their pocket.
The police are fighting a losing battle. Nobody is going to talk about the Adams family. Their silence is guaranteed by fear. An Adams dealer is accused of stealing drugs profits.
He was thought to be one of the Adams family lackeys, and it was rumoured that he crossed them. He was taken to a darkened room, firearms were produced, and he was told to kneel down. He believed he was going to be shot. The trigger was pulled, and instead of a bang, there was a click. And there was lots and lots of laughter.
For the police, enough is enough. The Adamses have gone a step too far.
It was beyond anything we were going to be able to deal with locally. It was something that was going to need a special unit. And obviously police officers knew of that idea of this special unit because that was what brought the craze down eventually.
The police create a special task force, led by the National Crime Squad, designed to bring the three Adams brothers down at any cost. This time, they have a stroke of luck.
I feel the hand of history upon our shoulder in respect of this. I really do. Now, maybe it's impossible to find a way through. Maybe even with the best faith in the world, you can't do it. But it's right to try.
I believe that people are determined. They all assured me last night that they're prepared to make the necessary moves that can put this all in place, and hopefully they are. I'll tell you tonight.
The Good Friday Agreement had largely brought peace to Northern Ireland and in turn to the mainland UK. So the security services had a bit of time on their hands, and they were very keen to justify their existence by getting involved in serious and organised crime, and they had a lot to offer.
2, do you have eyeball on suspect 1? All received.
MI5's counter-terrorism expertise is loaned out to the police even before the agreement is signed.
They started working hand in hand with the police to conduct an investigation into the Adams family, who were seen as the #1 target at that time.
The technology of spying, of surveillance, the techniques and the equipment were amazing. They were really starting to stream online. So their homes were secretly entered by spooks, essentially, and very, very, very top of the line pieces of listening equipment were put in place.
What it was a deal for 250 grand. But they said it wasn't worth 250, but 200. Who said that? The people you know? The geezer's come in all heavy, saying that he runs Islington. Well, he's fucked.
In Terry Adams' front room, the talk is of associates who've crossed the line.
He's using the family name. He's using the family name. So, this is a new year. I won't be fucked about this year. I want the geezer livened up. I want him hurt double back.
Another MI5 bug is hidden in a black taxi used by Tommy. It picks up evidence of a huge cannabis shipment.
Tommy thought he was being quite smart by never discussing anything other than when he was driving about. But MI5 simply bugged his car and recorded him talking in great detail about the shipments, and that gave them sufficient evidence to actually put him away.
Tommy is convicted for trafficking £8 million worth of cannabis. He's committed the ultimate sin. He's got caught. Terry is apoplectic.
You get a so-called brother saying he represents the family behind our back. He's trying to get us all fucking done. He deserves it all, worse than a fucking drug. I know what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna smash him in the face with an iron bar.
What are you, mate? You're mad.
I'm the cunt. I'm the cunt, and I'm gonna fucking have him. Dan, I've got something about me when things happen. When I hit someone with something, I do them damage.
Tommy's conviction is a turning point for the Adams brothers.
It was very significant because up to then they'd been completely impervious to any attempts really by law enforcement to bring them down. It was a line in the sand. It was a planting of a flag, by MI5 essentially in this case, that was saying, you're not untouchable. We will find a way to get at you. And I think it was a huge wake-up call for the Adams family because it messaged them then, you are not beyond the law. We will find a way to get you.
By now, the police are closing in, and an even greater blow to the family business is coming.
That's like a headshot to the Adams organisation. They can't pay their milk bill without Solly Nahomi.
With Tommy Adams convicted of drug trafficking, enemies are circling the embattled Adams brothers. The family's bookkeeper is on his way home.
Solly Nahomi was very much the centre of the Adams operation in terms of their finances. He was the man who knew where all the money was kept. He noticed a motorcycle at the end of the street revving its engine. And it seems that he knew what was about to happen. Solly made a run for it, trying to get to his front door, but was shot several times and died at the scene. Terry was absolutely distraught, not just about the death of someone that he considered a friend and had known for a long time, but also because this suddenly meant that he didn't know where a lot of the money and the assets that the family had put together over the years were going to be.
The Adams brothers have lost their financial wizard. The family is under siege.
This detective actually said to me, that's like a headshot to the Adams organisation. He said, they can't pay their milk bill without Solly Nahomi.
Police and customs are concerned that too often it's only the small fish that are caught, while the Mr. Bigs remain at large.
We're targeting the really serious criminals who've amassed great fortunes. They've got it through crime, they've evaded criminal conviction. We're going to go at them through the civil courts.
The murder of Solly Nahomi has left the Adams family weakened. New laws give the police a new line of attack. They copy a strategy used to bring down the most famous gangster in history.
Ironically, Capone is never convicted of the murders he and his gang commit. When he finally goes to jail, it is for not paying his income tax.
If you can't get them for the violent crime, then let's have a look at what they're doing with the proceeds. The police operation came in through the back door, if you like, because they had got the front door very firmly closed in terms of us getting very far with the violent crime.
£50 notes there, £2,500.
After years of chasing witnesses and damning evidence, the police finally have the tools they need to pick off the invulnerable Adams brothers, one by one.
It was done in Chicago with Al Capone. The rule still applies today. If you take away the assets, you take away the criminal finance, you take away their lifestyle, they start asking themselves, what am I in this for?
Instead of always trying to find the drugs and the guns, now perhaps we could search for the illegal money that they couldn't justify.
Terry Adams is the police's first target. This time, they follow the money.
When he went on trial, charged with money laundering, he couldn't prove that the money was legitimate, and consequently he was convicted.
Terry Adams is sentenced to 7 years in prison for money laundering.
Ultimately, it was Adams's conspicuous display of wealth which tripped him up. He stuffed his new home in North London with antiques and fine art, and when the Inland Revenue finally came sniffing round, he tried to claim he'd earned it all as a PR consultant.
One down, 2 brothers to go. Tommy is now released after serving his time for cannabis smuggling. But it's Patsy who the police have in their sights. The original Heartman starts to suspect that there's an informer in the Adams organisation.
Paul Tiernan was reputed to be an informant, a grass, a snitch, and in criminal circles there is no greater crime.
Patsy Adams is walking through familiar streets at the heart of the Adams turf. He glimpses longtime associate Paul Tiernan in the car.
Adams, come here a minute. I want to work with you.
You've been calling me a grass.
That's because you're a fucking grass.
Oh yeah? Who's told you that then?
Well, fucking you grass.
Well, some of that, mate, yeah? You want fucking some of that?
Tiernan survives. Patsy is caught on CCTV running from the scene. He's brought to trial and convicted. His sentence is 9 years. With Patsy in jail, Tommy is the last brother standing. And now, the police are closing in on him too.
Tommy was interesting to us because he had no visible means, on paper at least, of where he was getting his income from. Yet his lifestyle revealed that he must have been getting substantial income regularly from somewhere. The houses that he lived in, the vehicles that he drove around in, taking the whole family to Portugal for several weeks every year.
The police are bugging a cafe where Tommy regularly meets his associates. It's time to strike.
200 officers raided, the Adams, all their associates, everything. About 60 houses were raided. They were pulling out shoe boxes of £50 notes, and they couldn't substantiate it because they got no national insurance cards, they'd never put through a tax return. Well, where's it come from? It's got to be proceeds of crime, so we're having it.
The police strike lucky. At one address, they unearth a secret ledger which details criminal profits being channeled through a suspicious business. It's the final evidence they need.
The total value of monies has been estimated at $5 million for him personally and $2.5 million for his associates. It's actually a fantastic example of how an Al Capone approach can really take down some quite big and notorious organised criminal groups by looking at their financial assets.
Personally, I never really wanted to follow the money. Numbers on a page held no allure. But of course, time's moved on and detectives have realised that following the money can bring you around successes that searching for the drugs and the guns often doesn't.
In 2017, Tommy is convicted of money laundering. The last brother down. The untouchable Adams family has been outwitting the law for years. Now, the police have caught up. The Adams' reign as kingpins of the underworld is over.
Ultimately, they became out of sync with modern criminality. They weren't aware of the tricks and techniques that the security services could use against them. They weren't able to spend the wealth they had, so they kind of were out of sync. They were analog gangsters in a digital world.
We talk of gangs on the streets of London today. No, they're not gangs in this way. This was an old school type of gang, and I don't think we'll see many, if any, like that anymore.